Hello everyone. My name is Carrie Pruden. I'm a licensed practical nurse and I work for the Saskatchewan Association of Licensed Practical Nurses as the Professional Practice Standards and Ethics Consultant. Today's presentation will be a review of some of the learning that you may have already completed in your program about professional practice standards and ethics. This presentation is not meant to replace the learning that you have already taken, but it will be an adjunct to it. I have prepared the presentation from the view of the regulatory body. So you heard in that video that the CELPN exists for the public or the patients that LPNs provide care to, not for the individual LPN members. But who and what is the CELPN? The Saskatchewan Association of Licensed Practical Nurses has been given the authority and the responsibility to regulate the licensed practical nurse profession in Saskatchewan by the Licensed Practical Nurses Act 2000. It is the duty of the CELPN at all times to serve and protect the public and to exercise its powers and discharge responsibilities in the public interest and not in the interest of the membership. The objectives of the CELPN are to regulate the practice of the profession and govern the members in accordance with the Act and the bylaws, and to assure the public of the knowledge, skill, proficiency, and competency of the members in the practice of practical nursing. The Licensed Practical Nurse Act is the foundation of where we get the permission to regulate. It is within Saskatchewan legislation. It is a piece of law. The Saskatchewan government has delegated the authority to regulate LPN practice to the CELPN. If they had not, or if they ever change their mind in the future, this regulation would likely become a direct function of the government. It describes the what, where, when, and how of the profession. Within the Act, it defines licensed practical nurse practice as a licensed practical nurse means to provide services within the education and training of licensed practical nurses for the purposes of providing care, promoting health, and preventing illness. The CELPN did not make up this definition. It exists in the legislation. And worldwide, there is regulation. Among regulated fields are healthcare professionals, such as medical doctors and nurses, psychologists, lawyers, teachers, engineers, social workers, architects, accountants, tradespeople, such as plumbers and electricians, and some service industries as well. In some areas, bartenders, massage therapists. There are some states in the United States that also regulate hairdressers and cosmetologists. It's not just health professionals that are regulated. In the video, you heard about self-regulating professionals. What are those? What is that? Self-regulation is when the local government, in this case the Government of Saskatchewan, has delegated the authority of its regulatory functions to the profession itself, as they are believed to have the understanding of the necessary skills and knowledge to do the job. The mandate of any self-regulated profession is to protect the public. So how do health regulators protect the public? Generally, all health regulators have the same functions that protect the public: to ensure that the member is qualified to practice, that members are licensed, they will set the standards of practice and the code of ethics, and they will respond to complaints about the practice of individuals. The CELPN also has these same obligations to the public of Saskatchewan. The role or the mandate of this CELPN is public protection. We must ensure that we are mitigating risks posed by the practical nursing profession to the public that they serve. The nursing profession has risks. Healthcare is not exact. Nursing practice comes with risks, and it is these risks that CELPN is regulating. As you notice in the bottom two bullets, the CELPN protects the public from practitioners who are unqualified, incompetent, or unethical by approving education, ensuring competent practice, preventing poor practice, and intervening in cases of unacceptable practice. The CELPN registers and issues licenses to LPNs from within the province or outside the province or country who meet the entry to practice requirement as set out. Anyone practicing as an LPN in Saskatchewan must hold a current practicing license or graduate practical nurse license to practice or to work as an LPN. So the purpose of what CELPN does in very simple terms is that we set the rules for LPNs for obtaining and keeping a license, which includes authorizing the curriculum that you are taking and stepping in where there are concerns about an LPN's conduct or practice. I will talk a lot more about that a little bit later in the presentation. So who does the regulating? The CELPN Council operates as a board of directors, and they provide the high-level oversight of the finances of the organization. They create a strategic plan and monitor the results, and they are ultimately responsible for all areas of the organization. The CELPN Council is comprised of a mix of elected LPNs and government-appointed representatives. Because it is not possible for a board to run an organization like this, the Council hires an executive director who is responsible for the day-to-day operations. This person also advises the Council on matters that require Council decisions, such as the strategic plan, budgeting, bylaw creation, and provides information on regulatory trends that the Council needs to be kept informed of. The government delegates to the Council, who then delegates the day-to-day operations to the executive director, who then hires a team to carry out the operations. The CELPN is responsible to approve and review practical nursing programs. It was the CELPN that gave authorization to your school to teach the program so that you would be eligible for an LPN license. We determine the standards of practice and the code of ethics. I will elaborate more on these in a few minutes. The CELPN also must investigate complaints filed about an LPN's practice. Determining if an LPN has practiced inconsistently with the standards of practice and the code of ethics is what the CELPN Complaints Investigation and Discipline Department does. This could be a presentation in itself. One important thing to remember about the discipline process is that it is centered around public protection. There is a section on the CELPN website that, if you're interested, describes the process. You can review it on your own time. So how does CELPN do this regulation of the profession? There are rules that dictate how the CELPN will look after the risks to the public. When I talk about risks, I'm referring to the risks of nursing practice, things that an LPN does in their day-to-day work. The Act, as we know, is set out in Saskatchewan law by the legislature. From this piece of legislation, the CELPN needs to have more clearly defined requirements for its members and for the organization. This is done by creating bylaws. Regulatory bylaws define the authority of the CELPN to regulate the licensed practical nurses. These areas include membership and registration, licenses, continuing education, professional conduct, discipline, and specialized areas of practice. These types of bylaws, the regulatory bylaws, must be approved by the government before they can come into force. Administrative bylaws have been established to promote good administration of the organization. Some of the administrative bylaws include financial rules, council composition and terms, election procedures, and meetings. Fee bylaws are related to the fees the CELPN can charge to members and applicants for licensure and various services. Included in the fee bylaws are the initial registrations and licensing fees, renewal licensing fees, late fees, and other administrative fees. Within the regulatory bylaws, there are provisions that allow the CELPN to demand that all LPNs meet certain practice standards. A newly graduated practical nurse will have attained what we refer to as entry to practice competencies. There are also enforceable standards of practice and an enforceable code of ethics all LPNs must adhere to. There are three very important documents that you may already be familiar with. The entry to practice competencies are what can be expected of a newly graduated practical nurse. The document serves as a guide for curriculum development and for public and employer awareness of the practice expectations of the entry-level licensed practical nurse. The standards of practice and the code of ethics are legal documents that define the expectation of an LPN in all areas of practice in all stages of careers. They set the benchmark that your practice is measured against when determining competency and professionalism. Your program is setting you up to enter the profession with the entry competencies for your profession. We take a small subset of what you've learned to test you on the national exam. These entry to practice competencies inform the public of what all can be expected. The entry to practice competencies have recently been updated for the 2021 year and for the examination that will occur in 2022. As I mentioned, you should familiarize yourself with this document and with the competencies before starting your practice. There are 5 sections listed on your slide that form the entry to practice competencies. The standards of practice define the legal expectation of LPNs at all stages of practice, from novice to expert. They also define the minimum standard that is expected of LPNs at all stages of their career. These standards, along with the code of ethics, is what is used to measure competence and professionalism. Your nursing practice must be consistent with these standards and the code. When it is not, you would be guilty of professional incompetence or professional misconduct and could be subject to disciplinary sanctions by the CELPN. The 4 broad standards within the standards of practice are applicable to LPNs in all settings in which they practice. They provide the benchmark to which LPN practice is measured. These 4 broad standards are professional accountability and responsibility, knowledge-based practice, service to the public and self-regulation, and ethical practice. Within the Standards of Practice document, there are indicators to accompany each standard and describe more specifically the expectations for LPN practice. These standards are statements that every LPN should review on a regular basis and should consider their specific practice setting. Ask yourself, is my nursing practice consistent with these standards? Would anyone have reason to believe that my practice is not in alignment with these standards? The Code of Ethics articulates the ethical values and responsibilities that licensed practical nurses uphold and promote and to which they are accountable. These principles, although distinct, are interrelated and include responsibility to the public, responsibility to clients, responsibility to the profession, responsibility to colleagues, and responsibility to oneself. Just like the standards of practice, the Code of Ethics document has indicators that accompany each principle and describe more specifically the expectations for LPN practice. And, just like for the standards, this Code of Ethics document should be reviewed occasionally by all LPNs. So we have the Act, the big overall piece of law that defines the SALPN, defines LPNs and their practice. Then we have some of the regulations, the entry-level competencies, the standards, and the code. These are all required obligations for LPNs to make sure that they comply with. But what about the nuts and bolts of practice? What can an LPN actually do? Professional scope of practice is a definition that describes the services that a qualified health professional is deemed competent to perform and permitted to do. The professional scope of practice is defined as the range of roles, functions, responsibilities, and activities a regulated professional is authorized to perform within licensure. The definition that I mentioned earlier from the legislation plays a part in defining the professional scope. I will elaborate a little bit more on professional scope in the next several slides. So for these next few slides, I'm going to be referring to information in a document called LPN Practice in Saskatchewan. It is a document that I hope you are familiar with. If not, please make sure you review it, and it is available on the SALPN website. Defining LPN practice cannot be explained by a simple statement. There are several influences impacting the practice of any one LPN. There is the professional scope of practice, the employment scope, individual competence, and context of practice. What an LPN does cannot be narrowed down to a task list. As you know, there is more to giving a client their medication than just handing it to them. An LPN needs to understand what that medication is, how it works, how it might interact with other medications and diseases. So LPN practice is defined in the LPN Act. Remember that definition? The SALPN takes that information from the Act to set the outer boundaries for professional practice. This outer limit of the LPN professional scope of practice is determined by the knowledge, skills, and competencies authorized by the SALPN in accordance with the Licensed Practical Nurses Act 2000 and the regulatory bylaws. This basic scope of LPN practice, the basic scope of LPN practice is determined by the minimum required educational preparation to qualify for registration as a member. The other factors that determine how and what you are allowed to practice are employer policies and your own level of competence. This individual competence is important for the LPN to be aware of. It is your responsibility to recognize when you need additional education, training, or even just a refresher about a skill or a procedure. You must tell your employer. Your employer can't always know what you don't know. Not LPNs may provide the same types of care and interventions. The practice area might be different. There might be more or less staff. The needs of the client might dictate that an LPN is not the best provider to provide care. Or there might not be policies in place to allow you to do something. In some areas, LPNs are able to provide flu shots because the employer has created an education program and has the policies to support this practice. This context of care is the single largest factor in deciding what an LPN can do and where they can do it. The professional scope of practice is that outer limit that the SALPN has defined as allowable for the practical nursing profession. This professional scope of practice is made up of basic competencies, additional competencies, and specialized areas of practice. Basic competencies, as you can see at the base of the triangle, are the observable knowledge, skills, and abilities authorized by the SALPN as appropriate in LPN practice and taught in the practical nursing program. Additional competencies are the observable knowledge, skills, and abilities authorized by the SALPN as appropriate in LPN practice that are developed through education, training, and practice experience after graduating from a practical nursing education program. The specialized areas of practice are the knowledge, skills, and abilities authorized by the SALPN as appropriate in LPN practice that requires specific post-basic education outlined in the SALPN regulatory bylaws. Currently, there are 3 specialized areas of practice: perioperative nursing, advanced orthopedics, and hemodialysis care. So what are basic competencies? All competencies, whether they are basic or advanced, are observable. We use the term basic competencies or entry to practice competencies to define what knowledge, skills, and abilities an LPN will have when they graduate from the practical nursing program. Some examples of basic competencies are using appropriate medical terminology in reporting and documentation, demonstrating knowledge and ability to insert, manage, and remove a nasogastric tube, demonstrate knowledge and ability to apply critical thinking and critical inquiry throughout the nursing process related to pharmacology and medication administration. Once you complete your nursing education program, you will have acquired thousands of basic competencies. But what are the additional competencies? Through education, workshops, or in-services, LPNs can obtain additional knowledge and skill and ability beyond the basic competencies. Competencies obtained in this manner are referred to as additional competencies. It won't be very long into your practice when you start to gain a few of these additional competencies. You are learning the basic competencies now, the entry to practice competencies, but as you grow in your nursing practice, you will learn and develop additional competencies in order to be safe in a particular setting. Some examples of additional competencies would be that you demonstrate knowledge and ability to provide advanced health teaching and coaching as a lactation or breastfeeding consultant, or you would demonstrate knowledge and ability to adhere to agency policy and procedure for safe administration of medication by IV push. The SALPN competency profile describes the competencies that are within the professional scope of practice in Saskatchewan. It contains both basic and additional competencies. The profile is not inclusive of all potential competencies required of LPNs in Saskatchewan and is meant to be a living document. The profile will evolve and change as nursing practice, environments, and technology change. This profile is available on the SALPN website. There are many groups of people who will use this document for a variety of purposes. It is a practical tool for use by educators to aid in the design and maintenance of educational programs and curriculum development. Licensed practical nurses use the profile throughout their career as they plan and review their professional and career development. Employers and managers rely on the profile for performance management and appraisal, for continuing education, and for policy, procedure, or role development. Members of the public, other healthcare professionals, governments, internationally educated professionals, and other stakeholders may use the profile to understand what competencies are within the professional scope of practice for LPNs. The competency profile should always be the first place an LPN looks to see if a certain procedure or service is allowed to be performed by an LPN. Individual competence can and will vary throughout the stages of an LPN's career and is influenced by an LPN's practice experience, continuing education, and personal attributes of attitudes, values, and beliefs. Individual competence cannot exceed the professional scope of practice. Practice experience, education, and training do not alter nor expand the professional scope of practice of licensed practical nurses. Individual competence is the LPN's ability to apply and demonstrate competencies, which are the knowledge, skills, and abilities, within the LPN professional scope of practice in a safe and ethical manner. This can be shown by applying knowledge and skills, using critical thinking and inquiry, applying leadership traits and skills, using decision-making skills. Individual competence is different for each LPN. Through the course of a career, an LPN may find they lack competence in some competencies due to changes in employment role or setting, technology, and evolving nursing practice. These deficiencies and gaps, although expected, may lead to a risk of harm to the public if not properly addressed. Your own practice will be heavily influenced by employer policy and area of work. Employment role, developed by the employer, is typically based on the specific needs of the practice area and the patient population that the employer serves. This second point is really important. Just because you are educated and trained, the employer may put limits on your practice. The employers have a large responsibility to address risks within the practice area. They have to evaluate the needs of the client, the abilities of the staff, the number of staff, and the physical resources available when they are creating policies and at times putting limits on LPN practice. So we've talked about the legal requirements of being an LPN and what competencies an LPN can gain. I've mentioned how the employer role can affect practice, but how does this all come together? The context of practice is a consideration of the needs of the patient, the ability of the nurse, and the environment in which practice takes place. The College of Nurses of Ontario developed this three-factor framework, which the context of practice is built on. I will go into more detail with each of these three components, but this three-factor framework is incredibly important in nursing practice. There are four main patient factors: complexity, stability, predictability, and risk of negative outcomes. You will hear these terms often, and the CELPN has defined them as, for complexity, the degree to which a client's condition or situation is characterized or influenced by a range of variables. Stability, the degree to which a client's health status can be anticipated and the plan of care readily established, and the degree to which it is managed with interventions that have predictable outcomes. Predictability, the extent to which a client's outcomes and future care requirements can be anticipated. Risk for negative outcomes, the likelihood that a client will experience a negative outcome as a result of the client's health condition or as a response to treatment. So for the second factor, the nurse factors, individual nurse factors must be considered by the LPN to determine how to appropriately apply LPN practice. Examples of these individual factors can include individual level of competence to safely apply competencies within the professional scope of practice, individual level of knowledge and ability to know how and when to apply the knowledge, individual level of experience as an LPN within the practice setting, and an individual level of familiarity within a specific practice situation. Examples of environmental factors affecting the application of LPN practice include level of staffing and staff mix, availability and accessibility to consultation resources, availability and accessibility of required equipment, supplies, diagnostics, and surveillance tools, the intended purpose of the environment and of the practice area. Other examples include existing policy and procedures and risks related to the environment. It is important to remember that no one factor of the nurse, the patient, or the environment may be viewed without consideration of the other two. The context of practice is not static and must be assessed on an ongoing basis. So to recap, the basic scope of LPN practice is determined by the minimum required educational preparation to qualify for registration as a member. The outer limit of the LPN scope of practice is determined by the knowledge, skills, and competencies authorized by the SALPN in accordance with the Licensed Practical Nurses Act 2000 and the regulatory bylaws. Scope and scope of practice is not a task list. The SALPN also has requirements for both initial registration and licensure as well as for yearly renewal. The SALPN registrar provides detailed information to students on this topic. Your school will receive that package probably by way of video at a later date. I will review very quickly the Continuing Education Portfolio Program. The Continuing Education Portfolio Program was created as a formalized way for the SALPN to hold LPNs accountable for the lifelong learning that is required in our careers. For a nurse to remain competent throughout their career, ongoing education is not just good to have, but it is essential. Remember those pesky standards and ethics? Well, there are several statements in those documents that relate directly to continuing education. Once you become licensed with the SALPN, you will be required to obtain a certain number of continuing education hours every year. There is a video on the SALPN website that will describe this program in more detail for you. One of the principles that was used when developing the standards of practice is LPN standards encourage leadership through self-awareness and reflection, commitment to individual and professional growth, and promotion of the best possible service to the public. So in standard number 1, licensed practical nurses are accountable for their practice and responsible for ensuring that their practice and conduct meet both the standards of the profession and legislative requirements. The indicator 1.2, to engage in ongoing self-assessment of the professional practice and competence and seek opportunities for continuous learning. Now remember, you are held to these standards at all times. Standard number 2, licensed practical nurses possess knowledge obtained through practical nurse preparation and continuous learning relevant to their professional practice. Indicator 2.1, you are to possess current knowledge to support critical thinking and professional judgment. Access and use relevant and credible information technology and other resources. Review and integrate relevant nursing research findings into LPN practice. Maintain awareness of current trends and issues in healthcare and society that impact client and nursing outcomes. And you are expected to evolve your own LPN practice in response to changes and new developments affecting the profession. The Code of Ethics also has statements that relate to continuing education. Principle number 2, LPNs provide safe and competent care for their clients. The indicator 2.10 says that you are expected to apply new knowledge, technology, and scientific advances to promote safety, client satisfaction, and well-being. Principle 5, licensed practical nurses recognize and function within their personal and professional competence and values system. Indicator 5.6, engage in opportunities for career-long learning to continuously develop the competencies required to meet the ethical and regulatory requirements of the profession. So these two slides, show that if you are not engaged in continuing education throughout your career, you would be practicing inconsistently with these legal standards of practice and legal code of ethics and could be subject to disciplinary action by the CELPN. What does accountable and responsible mean? Accountability is the obligation to answer for the professional, ethical, and legal responsibilities of one's activities and actions. Responsibility is the ability to respond and answer for one's conduct and obligations, to be trustworthy, reliable, and dependable. Such things such as maintaining your nursing skills, staying within your scope, recognizing limitations and risks and appropriateness of your practice. Documentation falls within being accountable and responsible. You are accountable for errors. They will happen. So have that conversation with your colleagues and with your supervisor when it happens. You are accountable to your colleagues. You display this by giving a good report, showing up, being on time, being part of the team. Again, these notions of accountability and responsibility come back to your standards of practice and code of ethics. You will find sections in both documents, once again, on accountability and responsibility. LPNs are responsible to ensure competence in practice. You're also responsible to ensure that your knowledge is current and that you possess necessary knowledge, skills, abilities, critical thinking, attitudes, and clinical judgment to fulfill your role. You would also be responsible to identify when you require assistance or when an assignment of care is beyond your individual scope of practice, competence, education, or ability, and you're also expected to consult with the appropriate professional and recognize the need for a handoff of care. So by now you've heard the term professional incompetence and professional misconduct several times. The definitions for professional incompetence and professional misconduct come from the LPN Act. Professional competence is a question of fact, but the display by a member of a lack of knowledge, skill, or judgment, or a disregard for the welfare of a member of the public served by the profession of a nature or to an extent that demonstrates that the member is unfit to continue in the practice of the profession or to provide one or more of the services ordinarily provided as part of the practice of the profession. That is the legal definition of professional incompetence. Professional misconduct, again, comes from the LPN Act, is a question of fact, but any matter, conduct, or thing, whether or not disgraceful or dishonorable, is professional misconduct within the meaning of this Act if it is harmful to the best interest of the public or the members, if it tends to harm the standing of the profession, if it is a breach of this Act or the bylaws, or if it is a failure to comply with an order of the Counseling and Investigation Committee, the Discipline Committee, or the Council. Professional misconduct relates to how you behave, and professional incompetence relates to your knowledge, skill, and judgment in your practice. As an LPN, you are expected to demonstrate knowledge and ability to model professionalism. What qualities do you think of when you think of a professional, and how would you model professionalism? Some examples would be accountability, your appearance, attitude, behavior, collaboration, competence, dependability, effective resource utilization, lifelong learning, professional communication, responsibility, self-reflective practice. This is not an inclusive list of how you demonstrate professionalism every day when you are a nurse, but they are certainly highlights of what you should be considering when you go to work every day. So professional boundaries. Again, I won't spend too much time on this topic as it is covered in fairly good detail in your education program, but it's important. LPNs must demonstrate knowledge on how to effectively establish, maintain, and manage professional boundaries. LPNs must recognize and maintain appropriate boundaries related to many areas. So one really good example of not maintaining professional boundaries can be with improper use of social media. Things like breaches of privacy and confidentiality can get you into a lot of trouble very quickly. Using social media improperly may also compromise public safety or the trust in nurses. It can undermine individual nursing careers. And if you're using it inappropriately during working hours, that can cause a severe issue with your employment status. You need to be very mindful about what you say on social media as a professional. Once again, this goes back to the standards of practice and code of ethics. There are statements within the documents related to professional boundaries. To review, the standards of practice and the code of ethics are intertwined with every aspect of LPN practice. It is not so important to memorize all the indicators in the documents, but it is critical that you understand the 4 standards within the standards of practice and the 5 principles from the code of ethics. The professional scope of practice is determined by the CELPN. No single LPN will ever attain all the competencies that make up this professional scope of practice. Context of care is an important factor when determining how LPNs practice. So I have a couple parting thoughts for you as we finish up today. They may forget your name, but they will never forget how you made them feel. That's from Maya Angelou. She's an American author and poet. This next statement, I don't have an author who it's attributed to, but it's very, very true. When you're a nurse, you know that every day you will touch a life, or a life will touch yours. And that brings us to the end of this presentation. Thank you very much for watching. If you have questions, please email me at practice@salpin.com. I'm happy to answer questions about LPN practice, whether it's from a student perspective or from a licensed professional. Again, thank you very much. Goodbye.